Cameras on, sexy voice activate like what it do. I'm your host, the Marvelous One from the Michael vs. Marvelous podcast. But before we get into tonight's episode, if you guys can do me a big favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell button, so whenever I put out content, you can be the first to get into it. Like I said, if you read the title, read this before starting a podcast. And what I mean by that, don't start a podcast until you watch this video. And what I mean by that is because if you can check in the description below, I have the Michael vs. Marvelous podcast. And what I mean by that is how I tell people, if starting a podcast, everyone try to say it's easy, but it's really not easy. It takes a lot to go into it because you have to okay, so how do I break it down? If you're doing it solo like I mainly do it, it's a whole lot hard. And people think it's easy to put out all these episodes, but it's hard. When you have like 2 to 3 people, it's easy because you guys can bounce off ideas off each other. So if you're going into it with 2 to 3 people, 2 to 5 people, then you're on the right path of it. But a person that's going into it, and I'm talking to all the people that's doing it the solo route like me, it's gonna be hard. So you gotta make sure you keep your branding, your promoting. You gotta make sure you get your listeners. You gotta make sure you're telling people what time you're going live. You gotta, something that I struggle with is that I need to start putting out every episode each day, and I struggle with promoting myself. So what I tell people is when you getting started, don't expect that your first time you put a podcast, you're gonna get a whole bunch of listeners. Because when you first start, a lot of people are not gonna listen unless you already have a buzz from being on radio like I was, and you could just pitch in and tell people like, hey, my podcast is popping this day, it's dropping this day, you should check it out. Because I sit back and I think almost a year in of doing a podcast 100% by myself, learning everything. It's been a journey. It's not easy. I still struggle, even though I can do the podcast now very easily, kind of like do it in my sleep. But it's a lot of times where I sit back. When I first started, I remember my first episode, everybody was a no-show, because the first time I dropped a podcast, I think I probably had like 40 to 50 people listen. And that was just people that I knew. Now it have grown into something because I'm still grinding. I'm still not the best podcast out. Some people may say that. Shout out to all the people that say it about the Michael vs. Marvelous podcast. Like, I have changed it. First it was the LOFN podcast. First, I started off saying it was a Marvelous Myers podcast, and then me and my sister came up with the whole idea of the LOFM podcast, and I was like, no, I want LOFM to be the brand, because Michael vs. Marvelous is sometimes you get Michael, which is a sweetheart, sometimes you get Marvelous, which is a sweetheart too, but just don't have that I don't give a F mentality where if you're not supporting me or on the path that I'm going, it's like middle fingers to you, and I don't want nothing to do with you. But as I sit back and I constantly do these podcasts, I get better. I get better. So now I'm comfortable where I can do podcast seminars. I can do podcast videos like I'm doing right now, warning people, before you do a podcast, is watch these videos, because I started from the ground up. No one helped me with my editing. No one helped me with how to find my voice. No one helped me how to put music before. No one showed me how to, once I put in my ads, put this. It's like everything that I have learned to make my own thumbnails, to make the thumbnails be funny sometimes, make it to how I want to get the people attention. No one taught me that. I was self-taught. But if I would have had someone in the corner telling me that, then I think I would have been a little bit better. But for a person to be doing podcasts alone, I feel like I'm doing a pretty good job, and I feel like the people, my fans and my listeners, love what I'm doing. It's a motto that I have. There's something for everybody on my podcast. It's not just you come here for mental health, you come here for relationship, you come here for comedy, you come here for fun, you come here for fashion, from culture, hip hop, whatever you call sports, whatever nerd stuff, whatever your heart desire, I have something for everybody. And that, at first I didn't start off like that. When I first started off, it was strictly relationships, mental health, and everything else was off limits. I didn't touch on politics, I didn't touch on anything. But as I started to grow as a podcaster, aka a broadcaster, I started to realize you get more listeners when you expand your horizons. And to be a solo act, yes, you have to have the content and you have to keep the people sucked in. So you gotta have great topics to make people like, oh, I get what the Marvelous is saying. Oh, I get what Mike was saying. So before you start a podcast or anything media related, when it comes to this podcasting thing, watch this videos, because I feel like the tips that I have will get you to where you need to be. So I'm gonna give these tips. I kind of said it early in the video, but I'm gonna say it again. Is gotta promote yourself. Gotta keep branding yourself. You gotta be consistent. You gotta be consistent. You gotta set a schedule and stick to that schedule. If you say you're gonna put out podcasts Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, make sure you do that. If you say you're gonna put out a podcast one day, make sure you put that content out and make sure you put out the best podcast you can for however you can, no matter how many minutes you want a podcast. See, I used to do it 45 minutes. Now I cut it down to 30 minutes. Sometimes I may do 20 minutes, but you're gonna always get at least 20 minutes from me when it comes to my podcast. And that's just because I like to talk, but I also don't want to talk for an hour because I don't want to lose my listeners. When my listeners are like, okay, Marvelous been talking for too long, I got other stuff I got to do. So I try to keep it that people can get through 4 to 5 podcasts because they're 20 minutes. If you got a long drive from wherever your commute, or if you're at the gym, or you want to sit down and have some wine and take your nice bubble bath. The ladies do that a lot. Shout out to the ladies. I said I was going to give you all a kiss on here, but just make sure you're consistent. And make sure if you're doing it alone, you don't get discouraged when people don't support you and when you don't get the likes or you don't get the people that's coming and stuff like that. That's my biggest problem. And I'm just, like I said, I'm a year in. I'm just starting to get okay with people not supporting me, because it's not going to stop me from putting out the content. So that's all I got to say is, before you start a podcast, make sure you watch this video. If you're new to the channel, if you could do me a big favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell button, so whenever I put out LOFM TV content, you could be the first to get into it. If you're returning to the channel, like the video, share the video, tell a friend, tell a family member, tell whoever you know to come subscribe to LOFM TV. And like I said, once again, I'm the one and only, the Marvelous One.